Good morning. Thank you. Amen. We're learning Leila Nishmas Mindel Mariam Bas Kamen Reuven and Hashem Hashem Aliyah. We are going to be discussing giving a bris to a nafel. A nafel is someone who is non-viable. So if you recall, we discussed the other day that the way the Gemara frames it is a child who is born after 8 months of pregnancy is typically assumed to be non-viable. We discussed the poskim point out it's also with the caveat that the child has significant indications that the child is non-viable, and we're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail. So Tanya, all the way in the bottom of Kuf Lamed Hey Amud Beis by the Tanya, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the bottom, or 135b4. Tanya was taught in a brayso. Rav Shimon Gamliel says, Kol sheshash shloshim yom ba'adam eino naifel. Any human that survives for 30 days is not suspected of being a non-viable child. In other words, once a child passes 30 days, then we know for a fact that this child is a child that should be living. Okay, Shenemar, where do we get this from? Uvduyav ben chodesh tifta, because there's the halacha of pidyon haben is after 30 days. Okay, so you see that after 30 days, we know that a child is viable. That's why pidyon haben only takes place after 30 days. It's because that's the point that we know, this child is going to live, and now we could do the pidyon haben. Had it been before that, we don't know the child's going to live, and therefore we don't do a pidyon haben at that point. Okay? Shmonas yamim bevehema ein nefels. But whereas when it comes to an animal, it's not 30 days, but rather it's 8 days. Shenemar umiyom hashmini v'hala yeratzel karban. That there's a halacha that the karban is only able to be brought after 8 days, and before that it can't be brought. Why? Once again, for the same reason that before that it's not considered to be viable. Halo shaha sveika have. So the implication is that if a child does not yet survive for 30 days, it's considered uncertain that the animal is, that the human is going to be a viable human. Ask the Gemara, Mimhal Heichima Linale. If that's the case, if the idea is that before 30 days, and we assume that the child is not necessarily going to be alive, how do we circumcise this child specifically on Shabbos? Meaning during the week, okay, who cares? But on Shabbos, if you don't know that this is going to be a living child, so it's not necessarily a circumcision, it's not a bris milah, because the bris milah is for a living being, and there's not a living being. Why are we giving a bris milah? So the Gemara answers, Amar of Adabar Hava, Malanosomi Manavshach. The reason you're allowed to give a bris to every child, and we don't say, well, maybe since the child hasn't lived for 30 days, therefore maybe the child is not viable. The reason you're allowed to give a bris milah is as follows. Im chayhu shaper kamahel. Because there's two possibilities. One is the child's going to live. If the child's going to live, then great. If im lav, mechatich basarhu. And if let's say the child does not live on, if let's say the child is not a viable child, then what did you do? Ultimately, we treat the child, and this is a bit of a crass term, but we treat the child like a piece of meat, right? Are you allowed to cut a piece of meat on Shabbos? Of course you can, right? So miman of shach means like either way, it's okay. If you say the child, right? So again, 8 days, what we just established was only at 30 days do we establish that a child is actually viable. So before 30 days, so we're asking how do you give a bris milah? Answer is, either way, it's fine. Either the child is viable, in which case you did a proper bris milah, or the child is not viable, excuse me, or the child is not viable, in which case you're just cutting a piece of meat. So who cares? Okay, ask the Gemara. Velo hadatanya, that we learned earlier. Safek ben Shiva, Safek ben Shmona, Emechalan V'sa Shabbos. We learned earlier if there's a child who is either born in the 8th month, or even maybe born in the 7th month, maybe born in the 8th month, we said we don't do the bris milah on Shabbos. Amai, why not? Nimhali manavshach. Let's give the bris milah, right? Imchai hu shaper kamayel, right? In the case, so we're specifically in the case where it's either 7 or 8. We're not sure, right? We said if the child was born after a 7th-month pregnancy, that's fine. 8 months is the problematic one. So we say again, it's the same manavshach. If it's a viable child, right? Because maybe it was born after 7 months, then it's a good milah. If him lav, and let's say the child was born after 8 months, mechadich basarhu. All you're doing is cutting flesh. It's the same idea. Why do we do a regular bris milah, which also we're not 100% sure the child is viable, because we said either way it's going to be fine. Why don't we do the same thing for a child born during the 8th month, or at least potentially born during the 8th month? So Amar Mar B'Rei Ravina, Anav Rav Nechemia Nechumi Bar Zechariah Targimna. I and Rav Nechumi Bar Zechariah explain this brayso as follows: Mimal Hachinami Mal Dinale. They say, yeah, you're right. The brayso earlier that said we don't do bris milah, that's not what the brayso meant. Really, we do a bris milah. That is fine. Lo nitzrucha el machshirei milah v'alid Rabbi Eliezer. Really, what this brayso was saying when it says that you do not that you're not Mechal Shabbos, right? The terminology of the brayso was you are not Mechal Shabbos for this child. So the Gemara says, for bris milah, 100% you do the bris milah. Why? Because again, miman of shach. Either it's a viable child, in which case it's great, or it's not a viable child, in which case you're cutting meat. That's fine. If you recall, we had a machlokes earlier about Rebbe Eliezer and the Chacham about machshirei mila, right? Do you go ahead and chop trees and make knives and, make all the medicines? Rebbe Eliezer says you do that. You're allowed to do that for bris milah, whereas the Chacham said you can't. So this brisa, which says you can't be mechal Shabbos, is going according to the opinion of Rebbe Eliezer, who says that normally you're allowed to do machshirei bris milah. You're allowed to do all the preparations. And it's saying over here, by the Safek case, you're not allowed to do that. In other words, everyone agrees you could do the milah, but Rabbi Eliezer, who normally says you could do the machshirim, that's only for a bris vadai. That's only for a chai vadai. That's only when you know for certain that there's a viable child and it's a full-fledged bris. But if maybe all you're doing is preparing, to put some salt and whatever on a piece of meat, right? You can't do that, right? So it's only in the case of vadai you're allowed to do that, not in the case of a safek, and that's what the brisa was referring to. Good? Make sense? Okay. Amar Abaye, says Abaye, Kitanai. Whether a non-viable child is considered to be legally dead now is the subject of a dispute. Okay, Kitanai. So this is the Gemara says, meaning this whole discussion that we said until now, we've assumed that Rav Ada bar Hava assumed that a child which is non-viable is considered halachically not living right now. Okay, this is actually machlokas tanaim. Why? Okay, so the Torah says if one of your animals die, you have an animal that's meant to be eaten, and the animal dies. If you touch the carcass after the animal died, you are tamei. That's the end of the pasuk. Okay, so basically, if you touch, I've been seeing a lot of dead deer recently. I don't know. Yeah, no, just me. A lot of them, more than usual. Okay, so if you touch that dead deer, if you're one of those good people who pull those deer off the side, off the road, and pull them to the side, you become tamei at that point. Okay. So says the Gemara, says the Brisa, lahavi ben shmona shein shchitaso mitaharto. Okay, so it comes to include, an offspring of an 8th month to teach that slaughtering it does not make it tahar. Okay, so meaning this pasuk, the Gemara elsewhere learns that this pasuk is actually extra, and it has to be teaching us more than just the case of someone touching a nevela. And what it's coming to teach me is that if a person knows there's an animal that was born after 8 months, okay, so a domesticated animal, a kosher animal, also there, the same principle applies. If it's born after 7 months of pregnancy, fine. If it's born after 9 months of pregnancy, fine. If it's born after 8 months of pregnancy, it's not fine. And let's say a person goes ahead and shechts that animal, slaughters that animal, it does not make it tahar. It's still treated as tamei, right? It's not only an avela. It's not only when a person hits the deer and the deer now becomes tamei, but let's say a person goes ahead and slaughters a deer after 8 months, that deer is going to be considered tamei. The slaughtering would not make it, meaning, because even though the pasuk says nevela, the point is the pasuk also teaches me, again, we're not getting into the whole limud, but the pasuk, there's a riboy in the pasuk, teach me that if a person, not only in nevela, but even if I slaughter an slaughter an animal during the 8th month, the animal will be tamei. Okay? Yeah.
So in theory, a Kohen should be a butcher?
In theory, a Kohen should not be a butcher. If he's shechting, because you're saying he might shech the 8th month animal. Okay, let's see where we land with all that. Good, possibly. Let's see. You considering a career change?
No.
Okay, just checking. Okay, just kidding. Okay, Rav Yossi, Rav Yehuda, Rav Elazar, Rav Shimon Omrim, Shchitasu Mitaharto. Okay, however, Rav Yossi, the son of Yehuda, Rav Elazar, the son of Rav Shimon, say that no, slaughtering does make it tahar. In other words, normally, I think I missed an important point. If I slaughter an animal, a kosher animal, it's tahar, right? So as long as you're shechting regular viable animals, it doesn't make the animal tamei. Okay? The question is, what about slaughtering a non-viable animal? So the first opinion says it's tamei. It's like an avela. It's no different than an avela. It's dead, right? That's presumably the assumption. I basically shechted something which is already dead, and therefore it's an avela. It's effectively an avela. Whereas the second opinion, Rav Yossi, the son of Rav Yehuda, and Rav Elazar, the son of Rav Shimon, say no. The shechita of an 8th month of a non-viable of an 8th month born animal, it still is tar because it's shechita. It's not in the avela category. Okay, so my labakamifli, what are they arguing about? Demar savar chayhu. The latter opinions hold that it's a full-fledged living being, and therefore when I slaughter it, it's not an avela, it's a kosher animal. And just like when I slaughter a kosher animal, it's kosher, and it's tahar. So too, this animal who's born after 8 months, umar savar mesu. And the other opinions hold, the one that holds that it's an avela, that basically treat it like an avela. Why do they treat it like an avela? Because they hold a child born within 8 months is considered dead, right? So what do you see from here? And the assumption is that just like they argue about the animals And just like they're arguing about the animals, so too the same principle would apply by people, because this whole 8-month principle is true for domesticated animals or animals that are kosher, and the same principle of 8 months applies to human beings. And so you see that Rav Ada bar Ahava, who assumed in the last discussion that a child born after 8 months is going to be considered is not considered alive, that is the subject of a Tanaic dispute. Okay? Says Rava. Rava says, you're misreading this brisa. Amar Rava, ihachi, if you are correct that really what they're arguing about whether or not is alive or not, at a miflagi l'inyan tuma v'tara, liflagi l'inyan achila. Why are they arguing about tuma? Right? Their whole discussion is, if I touch that animal which was slaughtered after 8 months, there's a much more fundamental debate. If you hold that an animal born after 8 months is not considered alive, then there's a more fundamental issue you have before you talk about Tuma and Tara, and that is the animal kosher, right? Just like that deer on the side of the road, you can't go ahead and barbecue because it's an avela. If you're right in your interpretation, that really they're arguing about whether or not this animal born after 8 months is alive or not, so when you slaughter it, the first question is not Tuma or Tahara, are you tummy or not? The question is, can you eat this animal? Is it alive? Right? If you really are debating about alive or not alive, the real debate is it kosher or not?
But if you wait for it to be more than 30 days old, then it's okay, right?
If you wait for the animal, we said by animals it's 8 days to see if it's viable, but that's only a regular animal. Over here, if it's an animal that you knew was born after 8 months, then
it's not viable its entire life, even if it lives 30 years?
I believe so. I believe that's the saying. It doesn't make sense. I hear. You're saying, is this question only? You're saying, do we have this? Saying this debate might only be within the first 30 days. It could be. I'm not sure. That would make sense. Meaning, we treat all humans. And by extension all animals or vice versa, that it's after the first 30 days. That's true across the board. Fine. The question is, by a child or an animal born after 8 months and it lives after 30 days, how do we treat that? I'm not 100% sure. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Let them argue about eating. Okay. Ella, so Rabba says, you're misinterpreting this brisa. Tekuli alma mesu. Everyone agrees that really it's legally considered dead. As Rav Ada bar Ahava initially said, everyone really agrees that an animal born after 8 months and a person born after 8 months is legally considered dead. Rav Yosef, Rav Yehuda, Rav Elazar, Rav Shimon, Savri, kid treifa. However, the question is, do we treat it like a treifa? Treifa lav afagav de mesa hi shchitasim taharta. If it's something which is a treifa, what's a treifa? Treifa is something which is non-viable in the sense that it has like a puncture in the lung or something like that. So even though it's considered like it's dead, okay, its slaughter makes it tahar. Meaning you can't eat a treifa. Let's say a person slaughtered a treifa, right? It's obviously, right? You know that it had a puncture in the lung. You can't eat it. But it is tahar. It is tahar, okay, because we treat that, it's not an nevela. Hachinami loshna. Therefore, Rav Yosef Yehuda and say, here too, even though it's like a treifa in the sense that it is also non-viable because it was born after 8 months, it's also not going to be an avela. Rabbanan lo damli treifa, and the Rabbanan say, no, it's not like a treifa. Why? Treifa haisala shasa kosher. A treifa had a moment of fitness. In other words, what's a treifa? A treifa is an animal that's born regular with a regular lung, and then it gets a puncture in the lung. Something happened, a nail, whatever, I don't know, and it got a puncture. So it's not identical. This case, an 8-month-old or an animal born after 8 months is something which never had a moment of being viable. Right? Whereas a treifa did, and therefore you can't make a direct comparison. You can't say that it has the same properties as a treifa, right? Treifa haisla shasta kosher. Treifa had a moment of fitness. It was born. It was born normal, and then it became wounded. An animal born in the 8th month never had a moment of fitness. Ask the Gemara. That's not true for all treifas. There are animals that are born a treifa. There are animals that are born with a puncture in their lung. Right? What do you say there? So the Gemara says, Hasam yesh b'mina shchita, hacha im b'mina shchita. The Gemara says it's still not comparable, because when it comes to a treifa, yes, it's true. There are some animals that are born without punctured, and some animals that are born non-punctured, and then they get punctured. But so in the category of treifas, you have animals which are viable. It's true, this one is the exception that it was born non-viable. But in the general concept of treifa, you normally have viability followed by non-viability. And therefore, it's its own category. And therefore, we say when you shacht a treifa, no matter if it was born a treifa, not born a treifa, we treat it therefore as tahar. Whereas when it comes to an animal born after 8 months, that whole category is something which is different, and therefore we can't learn it from a treifa. Okay, and therefore, but the point that Rav is making is that don't ask a question of Adabar Hava, because why else would they be discussing Tuma and Tara? Clearly, they both agree that it is treated as dead. Clearly, they both agree you can't eat this animal. It's only a question of whether or not it's Tameh or Tahar based on a comparison to treifa, but everyone agrees to Rav Adabar Hava that treats a baby, whether it's an animal or a person born after 8 months, as dead. Okay, says the Gemara. Ibailu. Now we have a new question. Mi pligi Rabbanan Leid Rav Shimon Gamliel. Olo. Okay, so Rav Shimon Gamliel said that an animal is not assumed to be definitely viable until it's 8 days old. That's how we started today's discussion. Right, the Brisa said that an animal has to be 8 days old in order to be treated as viable. Do the Rabbanan disagree with that or not? In other words, is this Rav Shimon Gamliel's opinion alone? Or does everyone agree to him? Okay, imtim silver pligi, and if we say that they argue halacha kemoso or ain't halacha kemoso, is the halacha like Rav Shimon Gamliel that we have to wait 8 days until we assume it's viable, or do we hold like the Rabbanan that perhaps that there is another opinion that disagrees, and they would hold you'd be allowed to slaughter an animal even on day 1? So again, is there a debate? And if there's a debate, who do we hold like? So Tashma, let's try to bring an answer. Egel shenola b'yom tov. If a calf was born on Yom Tov, the Brisa says shochtin oso b'yom tov. You're allowed to slaughter it on Yom Tov. Okay, so it's a whole discussion about muksa, but the point is, what do you see? That you're allowed to slaughter it on the day it's born. So clearly, there are those who argue with Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, right? Because they're saying you're allowed to slaughter on day 1. So Gemara says, we're talking about a case where we knew that its months were completed. In other words, this whole discussion and so I think, sorry, Jesse, I think this answers your question, right? So this whole discussion of waiting a month or waiting 8 days is because we're normally misupik. We don't know. We don't know if the human couple was together. We don't know exactly. They weren't tracking what they were doing. And the animals, we have no idea what's going on. And therefore, normally we say we have to wait for a proof of viability. Animal 8 days, human 30 days. But if you knew for a fact this whole 8-day, 30-day thing does not exist. Thank you. Right? So therefore, the Gemara is saying that yes, it's true. There's a Bryce that says you slaughter on day 1, but that's because the animals cohabited, and then, and 9 months ago, and then the animals were separated into pens, males here, females here. You knew there was they were not together whatsoever after that, and therefore you know it's a viable animal. You don't have to wait the 8 days. Even if Shimon ben Gamliel would agree there, if you know for a fact, day 1 is fine. Right? No proof. Okay. Says the Gemara, Tashma, another attempt at proof. Shavin shimnolad hu umumo imo. Okay, there's a discussion about a bechor that's born with mumim, right? A bechor normally you have to give to the Kohen. If it's born with a mum, then you don't. So they agree, okay, that if it was born on Yom Tov with its permanent blemish, shezem and muchan, that it's considered prepared, you're allowed to slaughter it. In other words, if an animal that's a bechor, which normally would go to Kohen, you can't slaughter, but if it's born with a mum, then everyone agrees you can slaughter on that day. Again, it's day 1. So Gemara gives the same answer. We're talking about a case where it's months of, where we know that it had 9 months, and was, separated after that, and therefore it was completed. No issue. Tashma, a last proof. To Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha ki Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. If I tell you the halacha is like him, what's the implication? Halacha miklal to pligi. If I tell you the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, obviously the chachamim disagree. Right? Why else would I say halacha is like him? So Shema Mina, and that is indeed the proof. And so basically what comes out is like this, is that everyone agrees if we know that the child that it was 9 months of pregnancy, then the child then on day 1 you're allowed to slaughter it. If we're not sure, you have to wait until we're more certain that it's viable, and that normally is going to take place after 8 days with an animal. And we have machlokas. Ben Gamliel says you have to wait 8 days. The Chum say no, we don't have this concern about an animal. You can slaughter an animal on day 1, and we see that this is indeed is a machlokas, but we do paskin like Rav Shimon Gamliel that you do have to wait till 8 days to make sure the animal is viable. Okay, let's go a little further. Amar Abaye. It says Abaye regarding this machlokas. Now that we've established this machlokas between Rav Shimon Gamliel and the Rabbanan, we now are going to qualify it. Nafal min agago achla ari. If a child younger than 30 days, okay, a regular child where you don't know when the parents were together, was this a 7-month pregnancy, 8-month pregnancy, 9-month pregnancy? We don't know. Okay, and the child falls from a roof and tragically dies, or an animal eats it. Basically, some external cause. Divrei kol chayu. Both Rav Shimon Gamliel, who normally says you have to wait 30 days, and the Rabbanan who say you don't have to wait 30 days, they agree in this case we could assume it was a live animal. Whereas Rav Shimon Gamliel, who said you have to wait 30 days, was not saying you have to do that all the time. We're about to see when he says it. If a child is born, you can normally assume it's a live, normal child. It's only if it, and if, let's say, even if it dies before 30 days in an unnatural fashion, we say it was probably a regular child. When does he say that it's not really a viable child? Ki pligi shepiek umes. When do they disagree? When the child yawns and the child dies. In other words, something which is like nothing, right? Maybe we would call that like SIDS nowadays. Like basically something which is like what happened over there, right? But within 30 days, right? Meaning it would have to be something that is just like this doesn't make like there's nothing external happens and the child dies. Mar savar chayhu. One, meaning the Chachamim hold that if it was born and it died within 30 days, even after yawning, something small, say so what? It's a chai, it's a full-fledged alive animal person. Umar savar mesu. Whereas Rav Shimon Gamliel holds that it's not a viable child. Okay, now lamay nafkamina. What's the difference? Liftar mina yibum. The main difference is to exempt the mother from yibum, right? Let's say there's two brothers, and one of them is married to a woman, and she has a child, and the child dies within 30 days from yawning, from quote-unquote like nothing, right? So one opinion would say, or Ben Gamliel would say, this was not a viable child, and therefore if husband dies, she would be mechuyeves for yibum, whereas the Rabbanan say no, as long as we assume the child is viable, and therefore there's no chiyuv yibum. Yeah? Okay. Nafal min agag o achlari. Okay, so it says the Gemara, if the child fell from the roof and died, was eaten by an animal, divrei kal chayhu, does everyone agree that it's really a viable child? In other words, Abaye tried saying that they would both agree if it's an unnatural death, and we just have to assume it was alive, and that's the case. Ask the Gemara, v'hara papa Rav Huna braids Rav Yeshua, iklu levei braids Rav Idi bar Avin, v'avilahu igla tilsa. Okay, so all these sages went to the house of the son of Rav Idi bar Avin, and he prepared them a third-born calf. Remember, we saw that a couple of times. Third-born calf is seen as like a delicacy. Okay, bimama de shiva, and it was 7 days old. Okay, not 8 days old, right? So according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, it's not yet viable. V'amri lei, and now again, slaughtering is like what? Slaughtering is an external action. It's not an internal action, right? It's more similar to falling off the roof, right? So v'amri lei, and they said to him, I itzrechisu lei ala orta havyachlin minei. Had you delayed slaughtering until tonight, we would have eaten it from you. But the fact that you slaughtered on day 7, we're not eating. So right, now we're not going to eat it from you. Now, right? This should be a question on Abaye, because Abaye just established that even Rav Shimon ben Gamliel would agree that if a child within 30 days falls off a roof, we treat it as a viable child for all intents and purposes. So here too, this is no different than an animal being slaughtered on day 7, equivalent to a child within 30 days, who is slaughtered equivalent to falling off the roof, where everyone's treated as viable. And yet all these sages said, we're not eating it. Right? What's going on? So where it says, really, everyone holds that if the child yawned and died, all agree that we do suspect that it was not viable. Now we're changing, we're reconfiguring things. Really, everyone agrees that if the child yawns within 30 days, everyone would agree it's not viable, with implications for yibum. Where they argue, now we're reconfiguring it all. The argument is actually where the child falls off the roof. That's where they argue. Mar savar mesu. Rav Shimon Gamliel holds it was not a viable child. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel holds across the board. You need 30 days. If it's ever less than 30 days, we don't treat it as viable, right? And therefore, in our case of shchita, within 7 days, he would hold. Was it alive? No, right? That's the same case as falling off the roof. Umar Savar, the Chachamim holds chayu that it is a viable child, since we have no reason to believe the opposite when it falls off the roof. But everyone would agree, right? So now the way we reconfigured it, it would actually line up perfectly because we paskin like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, who holds that if an animal dies within 7 days, that it's not a viable animal. So here too, and like a child falls off a roof within 30 days, it's according to Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, it's not viable, and therefore similar over here too, the rabbis don't want to eat this food since it was slaughtered within 7 days. And according to Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, you would not eat such an animal. Let's stop over here.